Golbat is evolving. A Pokemon fanfiction by Aqua Teddy Bear from FanFiction.net. The night was a peaceful and cerulean city. The air was warm and the sky was clear, allowing millions upon millions of stars to scatter across the moonlight sky. A gentle breeze picked up a blue through the town, heading towards the Cape. It just so happened that a certain red-headed trainer had decided to camp out for the night not far from the Nugget Bridge. As the breeze blew around him, he shivered lightly before rolling over in his sleep and pulling the blanket he had tighter around him. The Cape was empty, except for him and Bill's grandfather, but he was over in his house. All the other trainers had left hours ago to go home and rest up for the night. The only noises that could be heard were the trees rustling from the breeze that occasionally blew by the water that rippled with even the slightly touch of anything. Other than that, all was quiet, until a sudden whimper broke the peace. The red-headed trainer, known as Silver, began to toss and turn in his sleep. He did this for a while, before jerking up in a cold sweat, gasping as he tried to catch his breath. Another nightmare. It seemed like he was having them more often than he ever had before. Sighing, he laid back on the ground and pushed the thoughts of his nightmare away for the time being. Instead, he thought back to his day. He thought how he was lost in Mount Moon, and how easily he had won against the Nugget Bridge challenge, figuring he should get a warm-up before the Dragon's Den. He smirked to himself before he remembered how bad he had lost to that girl, Lyra. That name made him sick. She was better than him, he knew that. What he didn't understand was why. He trained more than she possibly could have, studied everything on Pokemon that he could, and he had learned from his mistakes. What else did he have to do? That was when he finally thought of his nightmare. Yelling and screaming harsh words, all directed at him. He couldn't see anything. He was surrounded by darkness. The yelling never let up, but over all the yelling, he could hear a Pokemon cry. He couldn't tell what it was at first, but it slowly got louder and louder. It was Golbat's cry. The cry kept getting louder, until it was at an deafening level. All Silver could do was hold his hand over his ears as he screamed in fear. Only when the cry was at its loudest was there light. The cry kept sounding and the yelling continued, but now Silver was outside. As he turned around, he saw that it was him yelling. It was every insult he had ever thrown at Golbat, from the time he first caught it up till that very day. Every insult, every harsh word, all thrown back at him. He backed away horrified, only to trip over his own feet and fall backwards. Looking up, he could see his Golbat staring down at him with a hurt expression. That was when he woke up. As Silver put a hand to his face to push back his hair, he found his face wet. He was crying. A little surprised at this, quickly wiped his tears away, only to have more fall. His nightmares had never bothered him this much before. Usually, they were about his Pokemon, but this one had hurt. They had never been this bad before. Holding his hands over his face, Silver tried to figure out what was wrong with him. Did he really treat his Pokemon that badly? He knew he was a jerk to them, but it was to make them stronger. A strong Pokemon is a useful Pokemon, right? Then it clicked. That's what he was doing wrong. He needed to be nicer, to treat his Pokemon kindly and with respect. Praise them when they do a good job, comfort them when they mess up, and love them unconditionally. Exactly what everyone was telling him all along. Silver dried his face again and thought back to his dream once more. Why Golbat? He had been just as mean to his other Pokemon. Thinking back to earlier that day, he remembered the scolding he gave Golbat after he fainted from the battle. He couldn't even remember what Golbat had lost to, just how much he had yelled. He flinched at the thought as more tears suffused his eyes. He reached over to his Pokeballs and picked up Golbat's. He called the Pokemon out and watched as he stretched out his wings and got in an attack pose ready to battle. Looking around, Golbat was surprised to not see any other Pokemon or even a trainer, and just as surprised to see that it was still night out. Usually his trainer slept all through the night. However, all through RAR, Silver had done late-night training sessions before, and since they seen that girl Silver was always trying to beat, it wouldn't be anything really shocking. Looking over to his trainer, he was surprised to see Silver sitting on the ground with his head pointing downwards, not saying anything. Fearing the worst, Golbat slowly flew over to Silver and landed next to him. Golbat, Silver began as his voice broke, making Golbat step back a little in shock. I'm sorry. Had he heard that right? Did his master, the most aggressive trainer on the planet, say he was sorry? In confusion, Golbat stepped forward to his trainer and noticed his eyes were red and puffy. Had he been crying? Was this even his trainer? Silver turned towards Golbat, his lip quivering before bursting out in heavy sobs. Not sure of what to do, Golbat slowly wrapped his wings around his master's shoulder, closed his mouth, and pulled Silver closer. In return, Silver pulled Golbat into a tie huge, repeating the word sorry over and over again. Once he finally calmed down, Silver pulled away and stood up. Let's go for a walk. Silver sniffed as he started walking east of the spot they were at. Golbat hesitated for a moment, wondering if this really was his trainer before deciding that it would be the best to follow. Silver walked a little bit ahead of Golbat, who was flying not far from his head. Even with the moon shining as bright as it was still difficult to see with all the trees in the area. Once they reached a clearing, however, moonlight shone brightly over them. Golbat observed the area, finding that there was a pond as well as a stairway that lead up a hill and a house. Silver made his way over to the pond with his Pokemon close behind him. Sitting down at the edge of the water, Silver turned to Golbat. You could use my shoulders as a perch, if you want. Silver stated awkwardly, not really for sure how to phrase that he wanted to be closer to his Pokemon. Golbat fidgeting, he could keep Silver happy, carefully rested its feet on Silver's shoulders and closed its wings to its side. The two of them sat, looking at the reflection of the moon wavering in the clear water as the stars twinkled above them. In the distance, clay fairies could be heard. Not surprising on a night like this. Listen, Silver spoke up. I've had no right to treat you the way I've been treating you. You're a living being, just like me. I know I've called you weak, yet I had the very idea of someone even thinking like that about me. I've yelled at you even when you didn't deserve it. I thought I was toughing you up. But I wasn't. I was only hurting you. I should know how much being treated like garbage hurts. After all, I've been treated like that too. In the light of the moon, Golbat could see a tear rolling down Silver's face. My father isn't a nice man. He taught me that Pokemon were tools, and if I ever thought any differently, I was weak. It's no excuse though. I hate that man with everything in me. I promised myself I wouldn't turn into him. Yet, that's exactly what I've done. I've become every bit of the monster that he is. But Silver started before turning his head and looking at the Golbat on his shoulder. I promise I'll change. However, I don't expect you to believe me. Silver forced a smile and looked away. If you want to, you can leave. Golbat's eyes widened in shock. Leave? As in, be a wild Pokemon again? I'll keep your Pokeball. Silver started as he seen the confused look Golbat gave him. But just so no one can catch you, so you don't have to worry about another person like me catching you again. You just leave as a free Pokemon. The choice is up to you. Golbat had to think for a moment. He hadn't been a wild Pokemon in forever. He didn't know if he could make it. On the other hand, he could be free. He wouldn't have to worry about being tied down, or any more abuse from trainers. Then again, Silver said he would change. Thinking it over for another minute, Golbat decided. Flying off of Silver's shoulder, he flew in front of his trainer. So, I guess you're leaving then? Silver asked as tears filled his eyes. But he forced them back, not wanting to make Golbat think that he had to stay. Golbat shook his head with tears in his eyes and landed on Silver's lap. Looking at his confused master, Golbat closed his mouth and wrapped his wings around his master in a huge. Pokemon's body shook as he began to cry into Silver's chest, as if to say he never wanted to leave. He really cared about his master. Silver smiled as tears ran down his own face. In that moment, their bond was strong, like it never had been before. It shone too, because as the two cried over the pond in an embrace, Golbat began to glow white. Silver released his Pokemon and watched as his Golbat began to take a new shape. As the light faded, you could see that Golbat was no longer a Golbat, but a Crobat. Unsure of what had happened, the Pokemon looked up at Silver, who was beaming proudly down at him. Glancing over at the water, he stared in awe as he didn't look like himself anymore, but a new Pokemon. He had actually evolved. Golbat! You're Golbat! That's fantastic! This is great! Silver praised his new Pokemon. Thank you so much for staying. Silver was grinning the most he ever had in his whole life. Golbat smiled back, but couldn't help yawning. Chuckling, Silver stood up and held his friend close to his chest. Let's go back before someone steals the others. With that, Silver headed back to his camping site and rested peacefully, without nightmares, for the rest of the night.